On the evening of June 19th, 2024, an Easyjet Airbus A320 was on final approach to Corfu airport in Greece from London Gatwick. And whilst everything had proceeded exactly as it should, in a few moments the captain was going to be put in a position where he would have to make a split-second decision which could affect the lives of all 180 people on board.
Stop! Stop! Stop!
During the summer months is when the low-cost carriers really do make their money, flying to popular holiday destinations such as the one featured today, Corfu in Greece. Now, pilots really enjoy some of the approaches that you get with the airports in Greece because a lot of them still don't utilise things like ILS. But whilst the workload for these approaches can be a little bit heavier, it means it's a little bit more hands-on, so you get to fly the aircraft a little bit more than you normally would. On this flight, the co-pilot was the pilot flying and the captain was the pilot monitoring. Now, as mentioned earlier, like a lot of Greek airports, Corfu Airport doesn't have an ILS system, so the pilots were instead flying an RNAV approach. Now, this is certainly nothing unusual and something that both these pilots will most likely have done dozens of times before. And this approach in particular is really fun and really scenic. I've done it myself a few times in the sim and it's one of my favourite Greek approaches. What also makes this approach a little bit more unusual is that the final approach course on the chart that the aircraft will be flying on autopilot actually doesn't line up with the runway in what is known as an offset approach. Now, these kinds of approaches are a little bit more fun to fly because the pilots cannot rely on the automation. As you can see here, this is the final approach picture that the pilots would have been looking at, and as you can clearly see, the runway is not lined up with the approach path of the aircraft. This means that the pilots will then take out the autopilot and fly visually once they have got down below the cloud base and can clearly see the runway in front of them. Now, because there is no automation, the pilots are literally flying the aircraft by hand. The co-pilot was the pilot flying the aircraft on the approach, and the captain was the pilot monitoring, and he's basically just checking that the aircraft is on the right profile, aligned with the runway both horizontally and vertically, and of course handling communications with air traffic control. The aircraft was fully configured for landing and stabilized, and the pilots on this occasion were performing a flaps full landing, which will become important later on. At 1,000 feet the pilots heard 1,000 and the approach was all stable. This approach and landing then appeared to be just like any other. There was no significant weather, the aircraft was perfectly aligned both vertically and horizontally on the profile, the PAPIs of course helping the pilots guide themselves down vertically, and then came the point where they reached 50 feet above the runway, and then at 30 feet the first officer would start the flare, put thrust idle and bring the aircraft into land. Now, on this occasion, for whatever reason, the first officer flared a little bit too much, leading to an overflare, missing the main aiming point in the touchdown zone and finding themselves getting very close to the end of the touchdown zone. Now, you may have seen the runway markings before in your home flight simulator or even in real life, and the touchdown zone is identified by the white stripes, and the two big solid white rectangles are the aiming point for the pilots to touch down. However, if the pilot misses these, that's okay, as long as the main landing gear wheels touch down no later than the final white stripes, which still forms part of the touchdown zone. And if the aircraft misses this, it is called a long landing, because the landing is longer than it should have been. And that is exactly what was happening here. The aircraft wasn't getting down and making contact with the runway, touching down in that touchdown zone. However, at the very last second, the pilot flying, the co-pilot, did feel the aircraft make contact with the runway. And as he did, he instantly put the thrust levers to reverse idle. Now, seeing what was happening with the landing, the captain overseeing this and monitoring has a decision to make. You see, the runway in Corfu is 2,373 meters, which isn't short, but it isn't exactly long either. But as well as this, the main thing going through the captain's mind is if the aircraft misses the touchdown zone, a go-around is mandatory. And if you have made contact with the runway, then you need to perform a balked landing procedure. Now this is very similar to a go-around, but with a go-around you don't normally make contact with the runway. For the balked landing procedure you will have to touch the runway, so you have to fly the go-around slightly differently. And if you want to know how exactly this is done, then check out the YouTube video I've done on balked landings and go-arounds showing you the difference between the two. Link in the video description down below. So at this point the aircraft has indeed made contact with the runway and the pilot flying the co-pilot has set reverse idle. But the captain believes that this has been a long landing, they've missed that touchdown zone, and so they have to go around. Now of course in real time all of this is happening in split seconds and the captain needs to make that decision, and he decides to go around. He takes control from the first officer.
I have control.
And he immediately pushes the thrust levers to toga. Now what the captain had failed to realise is that upon making contact with the runway, the first officer had moved the thrust levers back to reverse idle. Doing this makes the spoilers deploy, as long as there's weight on the aircraft wheels, which of course there was. Things then very quickly got confusing for the captain. Remember how I said the aircraft was configured for a flaps full landing? Well, the aircraft never takes off flaps full, and so when the captain pushed the thrust levers to the toga position, yes, the aircraft screamed with a master caution because of a configuration error. He by this point also realised that he must have advanced the thrust levers from reverse idle and not idle all the way up to toga, meaning that the spoilers were now deployed, and the flight crew trailing manual tells the pilots they must not initiate a go-around after the selection of thrust reverse. In this moment of confusion then the captain moved the thrust levers all the way back to max reverse, and then for some reason back to toga. Now this is why the captains get paid the big money, because they have got to make those decisions and stick with them in a split second. With toga currently selected, both pilots realised they were probably running out of runway to complete a full takeoff, and the co-pilot called out "Stop!" and was pushing his side stick forward. However, this input was null and void because the commander had already kept his side stick priority button pressed after taking control. As the co-pilot called out "Stop," so too did the captain, and reverse max was selected once again on the thrust levers, and this was also coupled this time by maximum manual braking. And the aircraft did eventually come to a stop about 340 meters before the end of the runway. The captain thought that the touchdown had been a little firmer than normal, but after engineers had checked the aircraft out for a heavy landing, it turned out that the aircraft was absolutely fine and it was released for the next flight, and the incident crew actually flew it back to the UK as planned. Now, no cockpit voice recorder was available in this investigation because it had been overwritten following the return flight, and the investigators had to rely on data from the flight data recorders and the recollection of both pilots. The final report did classify this as a serious incident in which the balked landing go-around rapidly developed into a serious incident due to startle and surprise, leading to hesitation in deciding whether to reject or continue the go-around. When the captain took control to select toga, he had a plan in mind to go around. However, he unwittingly found himself going against what the training manual said for go-arounds near the ground, and he had a split second to make his decisions. And finally, whilst the investigation couldn't determine exactly where the aircraft's main landing wheels touched down, it was likely on or just after that final touchdown zone marker. Nobody was injured in this incident, and all's well that ends well. I would love to hear your thoughts on this video and the situation, and what would you have done had you been the pilot having to make that split second decision. I really hope you have enjoyed this video, and if you wanted to support us, don't forget you can grab yourself some fantastic scenery from the Contrail store using our 10% discount code as shown on screen, and the next time you're shopping with our channel partner Anybuilds, use the link in the video description as well to help support the channel when picking up your next piece of scenery or Anybuilds aircraft. Thank you so much for watching. If you have enjoyed it as well, please don't forget to leave a like, and if you are new to our channel, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notifications bell so you don't miss our next video, and of course live streamed flights. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you all again in the next one. Bye bye for now.